it's really my honor to introduce the speaker, Dr. Andrew Sage. Dr. Sage is assistant scientist with the Toronto Lung Transplant Program at the Toronto General Hospital Research Institution, and he's also assistant professor at the University of Toronto. His research is mostly focusing on identifying and transplanting novel biomarkers and the medical devices to aid in surgical decision making during lung transplantation. He has a keen interest in cutting edge technology such as machine learning and AI, as well as remote pilot aircrafts. What's worth to mention is that in 2021, Dr. Sage was part of the team that completed the world first delivery of human lungs for transplant via drones in downtown Toronto. You probably heard the news. It was all over everywhere. That was a really big breakthroughs, and I was very lucky to have worked with Dr. Sage on some of the AI projects in transplant. So during his talk today, he will talk about how AI can revolutionize transplant research. So without further ado, Andrew, all over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction, Bo. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group this afternoon. So what I wanted to do is to start off by just with an AI generated image of what AI thinks an OR looks like, and to kind of use that to introduce organ transplantation. As a field, it's a really important and growing field in medicine. And when we think about transplant, there's a couple of really unique elements to focus on, which really differentiate it from the rest of medicine. And I think the first thing is really, the fact that you have two patients. You have a donor patient and you have a recipient. And ultimately, it's the interaction between the two. There's two genomes. There's lots of different things and uniqueness of the procedure itself that lends itself really nice to AI. The other aspect to kind of capture, which is shown on the right here, is it's a relatively young field. When we look to the 50s and 60s for solid organ transplant for kidneys, livers, hearts, it is relatively young. And then when we think about lung itself, it's really only as of the mid 80s when the first successful lung transplant was done here in Toronto. So you have these kind of unique elements of transplant, and why do we do what we do? And I think the crux of this is, there are far more people with end stage organ failure than there are organs available. So unfortunately, that means that every 9 minutes another person is added to the transplant waiting list. And so because we have this supply and demand disparity, we're talking over 100,000 people that are currently waiting for organs. And when that situation arises, that ultimately means that there are a number of people that die each day waiting for their transplant. So this is really the driving force behind what we do in terms of trying to find innovative solutions to close this gap, to make sure that all patients with organ failure receive the organ that they need as quickly as possible. And, as I mentioned, the challenge arises, partially due to the number of patients, or due in large to the number of patients with end-stage organ failure. But on the supply side of things, we don't have enough donors. And, there's a policy aspect of that where, having policies, at the federal level to address that. But ultimately, too, there's another problem that we can address, closer to home when we look at organ utilization. And when you see the numbers along the bottom here, we're not currently using all of the organs that are made available to us. When it comes to lungs and hearts, we're using less than or about 30% or 20 to 30% of the organs that are actually offered for transplant. And same with livers and kidneys. We're only using about 3/4 of those that are offered. And when we think about why that is one of the challenges with the procedure, the complexity of it, is that if we're not able to reliably assess an organ, then we favor a more conservative approach. And so that's why a lot of the times potentially suitable organs might be turned down for transplant. And so, really the crux of all of this work is how do we close that gap, and how do we actually get there to be, using all of the organs that are offered for transplant? And that's it. In one sort of simple statement, it's really how can we be more accurate when we predict, the quality or the degree of injury of an organ, and how can we use that to parlay into, post-transplant outcome? And so I come from the lung team, and so for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about the work that we've done in lung. But I really wanted to talk about or address quickly the some of the fantastic work that's being done in the other solid organs. So starting on the top left with Dr. Moyetti's work with heart transplant, and really leveraging the donor and recipient matching. The work that's being done in kidney transplant, and looking at how we can use machine learning to better understand what's in a biopsy and in a transplant biopsy, and use that to, predict long-term outcomes. And then on the right here, two really important papers from Dr. Mamatha Bhatt here, also at UHN, in the liver transplant context, and really, again, using machine learning to identify risk factors for long-term survival, as well as the development of fibrosis. So there's a lot of parallels between the solid organs and what we're trying to predict and what we're trying to accomplish to solve that challenge. But as I mentioned, I'm part of the lung team, and so we want to focus really on what's happening in the lung space. And as I mentioned in the first slide, lung and lung transplant is a very proud thing for Toronto. Toronto was the first site of the double and single lung transplant in the mid-'80s, and we've grown to be the largest lung transplant program in the world. And so we really take this position of driving innovation. But also, too, we do have to address why, or can we find ways to address that 80% number of lungs that are not used for transplant. And so kind of to map out the patient journey and to kind of map out where all of these opportunities for AI exist, the following sort of image is trying to do that. And really, when we look at what's in blue, that's the transplant recipient. And so, they start in the waitlist phase, the pre-transplant phase. They progress to their operation, the transplant, and then we monitor post-operatively both the short-term and long-term outcomes. And in some cases, ultimately, patients need a transplant. And when we look at where the donor comes into play, that's really what's highlighted in that gold color. So we see, the conditions of the donors themselves on the top, but also this platform, which I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about, which is ex vivo lung perfusion, or EVLP. And when we think about AI now, we can actually use all of these different steps along the journey, and we can start to predict these events in the transplant patient's journey. So we can predict, whether or not patients are, passing away on the wait list, procedurally, short or long-term outcomes, and ultimately the failure of the graft and the requirement for a retransplant. But ultimately, too, we can look, chronically, what are the demands on the ICU? What are the demands in the hospital? Can we use AI to distinguish infection versus rejection? And we can move back up in the chain. We can do that, in the immediate phase post-transplant. Again, look at the same thing. And I wanted to really kind of highlight the demand on ICU requirements, because that's something we've really spent a lot of time on. And then lastly, then, can we use what's in the donor information? Can we look at the donor lung, and can we look at the donor themselves to actually then map out the rest of this? So there's lots of opportunity for AI. And what I wanted to then kind of focus on is the ex vivo platform. Now, if you haven't seen it before, this is a video of the ex vivo platform. It was a biotechnology platform invented here at Toronto by Dr. Khashoggi and Dr. Saipel. And it's become, an essential platform where we can keep the lungs alive outside the body for an extended period of time. So we maintain 37 degrees. The lungs are perfused. They're breathing with the support of an ICU grade ventilator. And so we can actually assess the lungs for, like as I said, hours. And so that really gives an opportunity to take now a lot of the lungs that might have been, previously rejected for transplant, and actually assessed and monitored on the circuit. And we can use that, additional information to make more informed transplant decisions. And that's had a really profound impact on the program. So EVLP was first used clinically in 2008. And you can see from the number of lung transplants performed, they've grown quite a bit leading up to the pandemic, where we were doing just over 200 transplants a year. And a lot of that, and most of that growth is due to ex vivo, the ability to rescue many organs that would have otherwise been turned down for transplant. So it's been a really unique platform and a really helpful platform. It's been approved in Canada and the States, and it's been adopted globally now. So we're seeing a really, big growth of this field, of this sort of new concept of ex vivo perfusion for transplant. And when we think of AI, now we can start to see what we could actually do and how we could leverage this platform. So, when we're looking at it clinically, it's a really unique platform. But when we look at it from a data perspective, and we look at the organ specific data, EVLP is pretty incredible because we have an opportunity to collect isolated organ data, which is really unique. When we think of a lot of the challenges we all run into with our data sets and AI modeling, when you've got confounders, you've got to deconvolute signals. On this platform, we've got just a lung, and so we know that any changes in lung physio or any physiological measurement is due to the lung. Any changes in the biochemistry of the perfusate is due to the lung. And we can also monitor biological signals. We can look at, inflammatory signals. We can also take images. And what's important is we do this for hours. And on the clinical side and on the research side, we can do this for days and really start to push the window of how long organs can be preserved on the system. So it's a really fantastic opportunity now to collect really unique data and study it using machine learning. And so the approach that we've taken when we've looked at our AI, our AI approach to transplant is really centered on three core elements, right? Because we know that just the model itself is only one mountain in the range, right? And we know that there are other key things we need to make sure that our AI is good AI and implementable AI that will be adopted. And so we also focus a lot on the clinical utility. How will that model be used, and making sure that there's smart design from the onset. And equally as important as well is the implementation. What does that look like in order to effectively change decision making or support decision making? So to make sure that the models that we have are propped up by good biomarkers and good endpoints, as well as things that are ultimately going to help guide and change decisions. So to kind of walk through each of these, the first question we often ask is what are the clinically useful biomarkers? And on top of that, so the biomarkers are the input to the model, but ultimately to what are the clinically useful endpoints? So to talk a little bit about those, I first wanted to highlight some of the work that Dr. Khoshabji and I did a couple of years ago, looking specifically just at inflammatory signals coming from the lung in the perfusate. So we focused on inflammatory cytokines. We measured them, and we used just simple biostatistics to generate a lung score based on the levels of IL-6 and IL-8 in the perfusate. And we used that then to, like I said, score the lungs on the degree of inflammation to then categorize lungs as either good lungs or poor lungs as it related to their degree of inflammation. And what was unique about this is it really started to prove, how important, individual biomarkers were from the lung to guide decision making. So this graphic here shows, one way in which we can do that, where we can look at lung physiology and lung inflammation in a simple 2D array, and we can identify regions of transplant or transplant outcomes, as well as transplant utilization. And so ultimately here you can see in that green zone where you've got really good gas exchange, low degree of inflammation, we are able to identify lungs that we're using the vast majority of them, but there are still some that are not used. And so those are ones that we can target to improve organ utilization rates. And then when we look at the two yellow zones, zone B and C, we see that the outcomes are quite comparable, but we're using very few of the zone C. So it really kind of gave us this evidence to support that the biomarkers that are coming off of the circuit are important, are related to outcome, and that we can use these in larger models. And so we, as proof of concept, demonstrated, a simple, again, statistical model to predict transplant suitability just between gas exchange and cytokines, and it worked quite well. And then we spent a lot of time looking at all of the different parameters coming off of the EVLP circuit to confirm that the biological or the biomarkers themselves were meaningful. But I think one of the other really important things we had to do when we were thinking about clinical utility is really the endpoints. Because when we know, when we think of the AI models that everyone's working on, we have to make sure that they're pointed in the right direction, that what they're going to predict is something that is going to change or support clinical practice. And so in transplant, that wasn't as well defined. So we spent a lot of time looking at that. And, in the research literature, the kind of the clinical standard, the current standard is graft dysfunction. And it's a relatively subjective score that's graded at multiple time points in the post-transplant period. And we wanted to know, or we wanted to think about whether or not that was the most pragmatic endpoint for machine learning. And so we worked closely with Dr. John Peel to investigate that and to investigate other endpoints. And to make a long story short, we really settled in on time to extubation. And what that means is post-transplant, patients and the donor lungs are supported by an ICU grade or a ventilator. And so there comes a time when that's no longer required and we're able to extubate the patient. And so we want to know what was that length of time that the patient required mechanical ventilator or ventilatory support. And so when we worked with John to kind of hone in on this endpoint, there was a number of really attractive features. It's a quantitative endpoint. It's clearly defined, and it's something that is practical for the surgical team when they're deciding on organs. And when we looked at it, one step even further, it's important to consider the demands on the hospital and the healthcare resources. And so what we did is we looked at how the time to extubation would affect the time in the ICU, hospital length of stay, and overall cost. And so what this is showing here is when we have a divide at 72 hours, so patients that were extubated within the first 3 days of their procedure versus those that were not, we can see the length of stay or the amount of time that a patient spent in the ICU was about 3 times longer for those that had higher demands on the ventilator. And that translated into more than 2.5 times the cost. So a really significant difference in the cost to the ICU and to the hospital. And that translated again into about a 2-fold increase in costs. So as we think about how we manage our resources and how we can use AI to kind of better understand the future, this was something that was really important and something that we felt was really good to target, because then we would know at the time or just prior to surgery what would be the demands in the ICU and what would be the demands in the hospital, and all of those factors we'd start to know prior to the patient coming out of surgery. So with that information in hand, we knew we had a good suite of biomarkers. We knew an endpoint of time to extubation was really important. Then we went into the machine learning approach and how do we actually predict that endpoint. And so working with Dr. Kashabji and Dr. Wang, we built the Insight model. And so this is the first AI model or machine learning model for an ex vivo organ. And as we expected, when we looked at all of this data, it was more accurate than anything that had been reported because, it reflects all of these different input parameters. And, importantly, we designed the model, and I'm going to spend some time kind of walking through it to really capture that spectrum and those endpoints as we were just like kind of honing in on in terms of time to extubation. And then the last piece too is, as transplant and even more so ex vivo is a young field, we really want to have something that can help to standardize and to capture, something to move the field forward, that everyone's, making similar clinical decisions. And so, from a overall theme, is basically we take all of that EVLP data, we process it using our machine learning, and then we use that to point into either transplants that resulted in extubation times less than 72 hours, more than 72 hours, and those lungs that are not suitable. Now, those color choices are on purpose because I like the analogy a lot of traffic lights in terms of green light, yellow light, red light, because transplant isn't clear-cut decision that you always must transplant, you mustn't transplant. It's not as binary in that sense. So we wanted to capture, when we're scoring donor lungs, this, gradation between green, in terms of these are really good lungs to proceed with. Red, these are ones where you would, they're generally they're unsuitable for transplant. And then yellow, in the same way that when, we're driving and it's a yellow light, there are times when you proceed with caution and you drive through, and there are times at the yellow light when you do stop. And so having that know-how of knowing what time to extubation greater than 72 hours means in terms of ICU length of stay, hospital length of stay, and all of those other things. It's that added piece of information that can help guide clinical decision making in the EVLP OR. Now, the framework itself was built on XGBoost, and I think a lot of people are quite familiar with that now. It's kind of become the model of choice or the framework of choice for a lot of healthcare applications. And the reason for that is simple, is it's, there's an interpretability to it because it is built on decision trees, and that makes it also quite efficient. But I think importantly too, for healthcare data, we know that there's, no absolutely perfect data set with no missing values. And so the way in which XGBoost can handle that really lends itself to medical applications. So using the XGBoost framework, we built the insight model. And what we used for our input is we basically took everything that we had studied over the years and used that as the input feature. So we captured things about the donor from the donor chart shown in the top left. Biologically, we're able to capture the cytokines that are in the perfusate and build on our previous work with IL-6 and IL-8. We can capture the physiological function of the lung, as well as the biochemistry and what's happening, in terms of the acidity of the circuit and glucose and lactate consumption. And even more than that, we can actually then take advantage of the longitudinal nature of EVLP. So we can extract features based on the patterns of the data that's been recorded every hour. And so all of that being said, we're looking at about 100 different aspects or features of the lung simultaneously when we're making our predictions. And to actually build and train and test the model, we used a very classic approach that entailed a total of 725 cases. So this is the largest data set that exists in the world, and it's a significantly large data set to train from in the context of ex vivo lung perfusion. So we had the model learn on about 500 cases, and we used standard 5-fold cross validation. So 1-fold held out for validation, and then we used 2 separate test data sets. And so both of those test data sets were around 100 cases each, and those were used to test the model that we trained. And as I mentioned before, it was really then pushed to predict those endpoints, the green light, yellow light, red light analogy. And simply put, the model works really well. So you can see here the area under the curve, so the ability of the model to discriminate between those 3 endpoints is around 70%, and that was maintained in both of our test sets. So really good performance. And we can actually go one step further, and we can see how the model's performing for each of the individual outcomes. And so when we look at the red lights and those lungs that are deemed unsuitable for transplant, the model performs very well of identifying those lungs that are not suitable for transplant with AUROC right around 90%. When we look at the green lights, the model also performs very well. It performs around 80% in terms of identifying those lungs that are likely to result in time to extubation less than 72. And finally, the yellow lights. Again, it performs significantly better than what's currently happening in the field. So we've got a marked improvement in terms of using the insight model. And we have a paper forthcoming on all of this that goes into greater detail in terms of the performance of the model. But I wanted to spend a couple of minutes highlighting the box at the bottom here. So, everything we just talked about, this is the performance of the model using the donor lung. So how likely is the donor lung to result in these specific outcomes? But now we know that transplant is a problem or a donor and recipient. And so we can actually personalize the model results for a given recipient. So we can take, who the intended recipient of that organ is. We can look at their age, their sex, their status, so the severity at time of transplant, their BMI, and their indication or the reason for transplant. And when we add those features in and basically modulate the donor model by that, we see the improvement of the model, or the model improves by about 6%. So we can then start to tailor how that donor would perform for that recipient, which is a really important aspect of transplant, but also of how these models can be used. So, that's the model itself. The kind of the third sphere of what we want to look at is now, at the end of the day, how do we ensure that it makes a meaningful impact, and how does it, will it affect clinical decision making? How do we know that that is the case? And so the first thing, we can do is we can build trust in our AI models. And one of the most kind of straightforward ways to do that is to show how it's actually arriving at its decisions. So we can look at the importance values of each of the input features and see what the model was weighting in when it made its decision. So this is showing here in the green. So basically what's driving model predictions for those lungs that do really well. And you can see at the top of the list are lung physiology measures, so things like compliance and gas exchange. So that's really good because that kind of supports the clinical intuition of known parameters of lung injury. But what's also really helpful is that we've got other elements like calcium and things like base excess, which are recorded but not necessarily closely monitored. And so the model's picking up on other nuances or other trends in the data. So it's really kind of showing that, there is reassurance that the model is looking at the right things, but it's also showing that the model is looking at additional features. And we can see when we look at the, prolonged time to extubation, that rank order changes in terms of what's important for predicting that outcomes, and things like IL-8 move up in the list to be quite an important feature that would be driving the time that patients would spend on a ventilator and in the ICU. And again, we can look at it for the from the perspective of what makes a lung unsuitable for transplant. So the key takeaway here is that we're able to actually capture and be able to show how the model made its decision. And that was really important for kind of moving further or closer and closer to that implementable stage. The other thing too is, we have to be able to streamline this data. That's not something that people are going to want to look at all the raw data and all of this that we've just talked about at 2:30, 3 in the morning. So we've worked to actually build out a dashboard where we can quickly convey the model information to the transplant team so that they, instantly know, what the model is suggesting about that lung. And so here's an example of a very good lung where we can see, the transplant suitability of that given lung quite high. And so there's a really high likelihood that that lung would be transplanted. And then if that lung proceeds to transplant, there's a really high likelihood that that lung or that patient would ultimately be extubated really quickly or within 72 hours of transplant. And, in contrast, a very poor lung. So you can see there's a really high likelihood that that lung would be declined. And that if that lung were to proceed with transplant, there's a very low chance that that lung would actually result in a time to extubation less than 72. So this is really something now as we move towards implementation that we can start to build out from, and how all of this information can be used. But at the end of the day, we have to know whether or not it'll change clinical decision making. And so we've been working with Dr. Laura Donahoe in the transplant team to formally investigate the impacts of the Insight model using a clinical review panel. And so what we've done is we've taken clinical EVLPs at UHN that have happened. We've generated the Insight results retrospectively, and we've established a review panel consisting of surgeons, perfusion specialists, our surgical fellows, EVLP assistants, and really have them look at the case, standard assessment parameters, and look at the EVLP decision, or what would be the EVLP or the transplant decision in that scenario. And then we can provide the Insight results, and we can see, how does the decision making change for the review panel. And ultimately, then we can have an estimate in this setting of, the degree to which organ utilization and recipient outcomes will change. And so this table captures the results of that study. And what you can see in the far left here is that, historically, these are the outcomes that happened. The lungs that were transplanted did well, poorly, those were unsuitable. And you compare that to what the model predicted to be true. And so when you look across the top here, for lungs that did well and were predicted to do well, we have an increase in transplant decisions. So having AI helped increase the number of transplant decisions, so more favorable towards transplant. The converse was true, that when AI was present for the lungs that were deemed unsuitable for transplant, there was a drop in the number of transplant decisions. And what's interesting is for the lungs that had the prolonged time to extubation, when the AI model was present, the number of transplant decisions dropped. So we can say we have evidence that there was, a tendency not to transplant these lungs because of now what we know about the increased demands on ventilator and ICU. And that was almost offset by lungs that were historically turned down, but when the model looked at the donor injury and said that lung likely would have done well, we see the corresponding increase in transplant decisions. And so this all boils down to the table on the bottom here, which basically says that if a lung was suitable for transplant in this study, having AI significantly increased the odds of transplant. And if a lung was unsuitable, having AI significantly decreased the chances of transplant. And what was also quite interesting is we were able to separate based on experience. And when if I circle back to the concept of a EVLP being, quite young and only being around for about a decade, there is quite a difference in terms of EVLP experience. And the key takeaway from this table is that when the AI model was present, those with less experience made decisions that were more aligned with those with more experience. So ultimately, AI can help kind of bridge that gap, that training gap or that experience gap for inexperienced or people that are less experienced with ex vivo perfusion. And so that was really, really strong evidence and really good. But ultimately that lends itself to the next step. And so we've are kicking off this summer the Astute study, which is a prospective study here at UHN, where we're going to evaluate the Insight model in the clinical OR in a very similar fashion, but really be able to then gauge the real world impacts of having AI in the transplant OR. And so this story is just part of the story, and I wanted to just kind of highlight a couple of other really interesting things that we can do with ex vivo and AI in the transplant space. And so for anyone that's a radiologist in the room, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the image on the left. So a standard chest radiograph in which we see, the chest wall, the ribs, and the heart. But what's really unique about the platform, as I've mentioned, it's an isolated lung. So when we take an X-ray of the isolated lung, we can see a very pristine and unobstructed view of the lung, where we can actually see individual lobes, we can see the vasculature. And so this is a kind of a really unique image now that we can start to apply machine learning to. And in a similar approach, the first thing we wanted to do is to make sure that there was important prognostic information in these X-rays. So we teamed up with Dr. McInnes to score the lungs using traditional radiographic scoring techniques to understand that we do see elements of aspiration, pneumonia, edema in the lungs, and that is associated with outcome. But there's a big but there, and that's really how do we make that information accessible during EVLP? Because at the end of the day, we don't have a radiologist in the room looking at the radiographs collected during EVLP. So our PhD student really sought to make this information accessible using machine learning and using CNN. And so what Bonnie did is she first pre-trained a model using over 100,000 chest X-ray images from the NIH to build a CNN network that was then fine-tuned and trained on the ex vivo radiographs to ultimately, first wanted to confirm that the model could predict just abnormalities in an EVLP radiograph, and it did that extremely well with an accuracy close to 90%. So we then moved on to the same approach. Can we use that CNN model to then predict these outcomes of transplant patients? And so this captures what's currently happening. We have multiple X-rays taken during a case. We have the CNN model, which then concatenates them into one final vector. And that actually predicts the decision to transplant with an accuracy of 83%. And the first question that might come to mind is, how does that compare to what was done previously with the manually labeled radiographs? And the accuracy was 80%. So one would argue that we're performing the analyses of a fellowship trained radiologist at the same level, with the significant difference of this takes a minute, and this can be run in any clinical ex vivo setting. So really kind of making the information that's in the X-rays available to the transplant teams in a really quick turnaround time, which is a really fantastic sort of improvement and an achievement for the field. So the other thing too to highlight is, we talked a lot about, all of this data coming from the circuit, but historically the data is often collected hourly. So what can we do if we change that? What if we increase sampling frequency and getting even more data? And so another PhD student in our team has gone in and done that, has collected, on the biological side, samples every 15 minutes to see if we've got these more resolved profiles, does it improve model accuracy? And the short answer to that is yes. We see a significant gain in model performance when we have more samples, because we have a better understanding of the time series data, which we can then, and we have been using now to build out towards these other functional parameters, functional assessments. So we're seeing, highly resolved patterns of the data being generated by the individual lungs. And I think that's really kind of clear when we talk about this example of the work that Ellie's done. The ventilator itself, like I said, is an ICU grade ventilator that records pressure and flow data every 10 milliseconds. And so we can use that to reconstruct every breath that was recorded during the case. And from every breath, then we can extract all of the relevant physiological parameters like compliance. And so, we now have over 1 million data points per case, which is quite striking when we look at it in this way. So historically, this is the data that we'd collect. We'd measure compliance hourly, and we'd build successful models from this. But now when we look at breath by breath analyses, you can actually see a highly resolved pattern in the individual breaths of the case. And we can actually see what's happening in between those assessment periods, and be able to now learn from this pattern and be able to make predictions and improve predictions based on this. So this is just an example showing dynamic compliance, which we've done, but we can do it for all of the parameters. And again, we bring into the team critical care expert, Dr. Del Sorbo, to help annotate these graphs and look at what's happening during the case clinically. And we know how we can leverage machine learning to learn clinically what's happening in this waveform. So we can see when the lungs are being assessed, what's happening to the compliance before it's being assessed, during the assessment, and after the assessment. So all of this really lends itself now to, again, more neural networks. We can take this new input data and we can apply a CNN model to actually now predict outcomes in the same way that we've done, and really kind of keep building on what we've done with this highly resolved data. And so, to make a long story short, having this additional data, to have this breath by breath data, had a significant improvement in model performance. So, something that really shows the power of adding more data in the EVLP platform to generate that data quite readily. And so the last thing to talk about in the final few minutes is really, how does this all come together and where do we go next? And, the image here is, predicting a storm. And I think it's quite important to think of it that way, because at the end of the day, what we can do with all of this data on the ex vivo lung perfusion and ultimately the ex vivo organ perfusion, because this exists for the heart, the liver, the kidney, the pancreas. We want to take all of those data feeds and be able to forecast or simulate the organ. And what that really means is, can we generate a digital organ? And the overarching theme work is really looking at a digital twin, which is a computer generated replica of something in the physical world. And this comes from the automotive industry or the engineering space, where they've done it for years, where they've looked at cars, they've looked at engines, airplanes, you name it, where they've actually built a computer model of that component, and they've been able to then simulate changes to that component rather than build the real world component and kind of go through these iterative processes. You can actually do it all via simulation. And so the concept now is, can we take all of the stuff that we have with ex vivo in a similar way and generate a digital lung? And can we forecast, what is the performance of that lung in an hour, in 2 hours, in 3 hours? And so, this is one of the early figures where we actually looked at, the first 2 hours. This is gas exchange in a lung. We said, okay, what was the gas exchange from the first 2 hours of that particular lung? Can we learn that pattern and predict the remaining hour of this case? And so what this data shows is, in red, this is what the model predicted. And the black is what actually happened. And you can see that there's quite a good agreement between, the forecasted data or the simulated data and the actual data. And so this is a really encouraging step towards that digital twin. And how do we use this when we get to the fully validated model? It'll really change how we do clinical studies, because at the end of the day, we'll be able to test novel therapies on digital organs or digital twins rather than the organs themselves. We'll be able to do these iterative processes and accelerate the time to bedside, because we're able to do this using machine learning and the AI approach to ex vivo data. And so, like I said, that extends to all organs, which really kind of as a final slide, we have the capability at Toronto General because, the team has built the organ repair labs at UHN, which is the first in the world. And these are, dedicated organ labs specifically for the lung, liver, heart, kidney, pancreas. And they're built as state-of-the-art centers. So they're fully AI compatible. The servers, we've got cloud connectivity. And you've got all of the high performing cameras and videos to do this type of analyses in real time, and quickly implement all of the work that we've done in the clinical setting. So with that, I would like to just acknowledge all of the team members of the Toronto Lung Transplant Program, TGHRI, to really help do a lot of this work, as well as our funding partners. So with that, I thank you again for your attention. Look forward to any questions or collaborations. My contact information is there. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Andrew, for the great talk. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand or just simply speak up. Maybe while we are waiting for people to either type or think of questions, Andrew, I have a question about kind of the future directions.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we are taking lots of modalities now. We have the time series data, we have imaging, we have all the biochemical, more or less like tabular data collected from EVLP. How, like, what will happen if some of the data contradicting with each other? Let's say the imaging says this is not transplantable, but the biochemical data says it may be transplantable.
Mm-hmm.
So which data should we trust more?
Well, I mean, it's a really good point, and I think at the end of the day, the first thing that we would want to ensure is, at the end of the day, the surgeon has the ultimate discretion. So, as the surgeon looks at the X-ray and says, I see that, and that's going to change my decision either way, or I'm going to look at that piece of information and weight it more than the biochemical data. So at the end of the day, the decision making will ultimately and always remain with the surgeon. But I think it's also really important to have that ability in the dashboard to see where all of these inputs came from, so that you can see where there could be those discrepancies, and you could see where maybe they don't quite align. and then there's the ability to put it all together and kind of see. But I think that is one of the most important aspects of having that ability to see what's driving the model predictions, because then that ultimately, if that scenario were to arise, you would see it. And I think it would ultimately look like a prediction that's not overly confident, right? Like the prediction confidence wouldn't be high from the model perspective. And then therefore, then the surgeon could see why that is and then make a decision from there.
I see. And yeah, Myron?
Fascinating work. Congratulations. I really enjoyed your presentation. Glad that I now better am able to appreciate your work. I mean, my understanding is that one of the main goals of the ex vivo perfusion is not only to assess lungs, but in the future to start repairing lungs as well. And so my question now relates as to, I mean, you've now defined some parameters as to what are the ideal parameters for assessment for lungs that are not repaired. But based on, do you need more? Do you need to gather more parameters in order to facilitate or to learn whether repaired lungs are now suitable? So, for example, I mean, so the physiological parameters of the lungs, compliance, for example, was very important. Whereas I recall that the cytokine data were way down on the list. So first, will you learn from these things as to what parameters or what genes need to be targeted in order to repair? And then for monitoring repair, do you need to expand your data sets to utilize AI in the future?
Yeah, I think, kind of working backwards there, at the end of the day, one of the things that we're doing is there's a really good pairing between the clinical side and the research side. So as, therapies are being tested on the research side, and maybe there are, specific parameters to a given drug or pathways targeted, and we can start to extract that data and build those data sets so that we ultimately meet that future where we've got that if drug X requires a different protein, that we've got data to kind of build that out. So I think in that aspect, that's really kind of a good feature we have to be able to do, collect the same data from the same protocol, but on the research side as we test therapies and we test different interventions. And I think at the end of the day, like from what we see here, the parameters are defining, what are the characteristics of a donor lung, and how that could ultimately impact the recipient's outcome. And so I think there's also an element of, even if this parameter complement were to stay the same, that if a drug does improve the IL-8 levels or does improve compliance, and that relative performance of each of those shifts in the direction that makes a lung that was previously, say, a yellow light, a green light, that's also another way we can monitor the effectiveness of therapies. Because I think there's this, also like a really exciting possibility where you've got lungs that are, say, currently red light, that, they're not suitable for transplant. You provide therapies, and using the same markers, as the lung improves, it progresses from red to yellow to green with time. And I think that's really something we'd want to work towards, like I said, on top of adding the research database to all of this.
Andrew, can you comment on as Myron said, like ultimately we want to repair lungs and make them better for transplant. But can you comment on how the concept of a digital twin can help us predict the response of that lung without actually carrying out that experiment?
Yeah, so there's two elements of the digital twin that we really want to focus on, and this one here would be one where once we've got a really good model, as we're kind of building on the data that we currently have, that in a way simulates or behaves like the lung would in its real world setting. We could also start to then add in the research data set, where you could then start to say, purely from a computational perspective, what happens if we give drug X to that lung, and you could simulate the lung, how it would perform in 3 hours time. And so ultimately it could run through all of these different iterations like in a generative style and say, look, what we know about this lung now, this is the best drug for it. And we can use it in that way to actually better select which therapy is most likely to repair the lung and what it'll look like in, hours or a few hours or days time using AI. And I think that's a really kind of would be a really transformative approach to how we would do that, rather than, kind of treat all or treat none. We would be able to say, we'd be really precise and leverage the AI and ML capabilities in that platform and do generative AI and say, this is the best drug for that given lung.
Any questions? Any other questions from the audience? All right. If not, I think we're just about time, a little bit early, but thank you, Andrew, for the great presentation, and definitely welcome everyone's comments. So feel free to send us emails if you have any further questions or comments. Look forward to hearing from you. All right, with that, thank you everyone for attending, and we're gonna keep rolling out future AI rounds. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. Have a great day.